I'm a retired medical doctor and have been an energy climate activist in Asheville for the last 10 years, working in the faith community a lot with North Carolina Interfaith Power and Light and working with the Western North Carolina Green congregations for the past year and a half or so. And I'm a retired medical doctor. I'm not a theologian. I'm not ordained. I have a very deep interest in religion. In fact, I was a philosophy major at the university before I went into medicine. Today, though, I'm going to speak as an ordinary citizen, as a parent, and as a grandparent. And I'm going to speak of the hope that I now have after taking 5 young people from the Asheville area to Power Shift in Pittsburgh a couple weeks ago. And hopefully a few of those young people will be here to give testimony to the EPA. The reason that I'm hopeful is because that at the Power Shift conference in Pittsburgh, there were 6,000 young people, and it was the most diverse crowd I've ever been in. There were African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos, and they not only were participants in the conference, they gave plenary talks, they sat on stage on panels, and they led workshops. And the workshops were not just about climate change and energy, but they were all about the intersection of every one of the concerns, the moral concerns that you all and I reflect on a daily basis because they're in the news. We're here today to remember the victims of Superstorm Sandy. And if you've listened to the news this week, there are lots of events in New York, a lot of candlelight ceremonies in New York and New Jersey today. And there's also events around the country just like ours. Some of them are held in churches and synagogues, and some of them are held in community centers. And they're held to honor the victims of Sandy who are still suffering. And if you pay attention to the news, you know that there are many, 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 many who are still not living in decent housing and are having trouble finding ways to rebuild their lives. 181 Americans were killed in that storm. Over 360 some were killed internationally. In the United States alone, it's estimated that the damage was $62 billion. I want to talk a little bit about empathy and compassion. We are a very privileged group here tonight. If you look around the room, my friend Melissa is the only African American in the audience, and most of us are fairly well-off middle-class people. And the effects of climate change are affecting the poor, the elderly, the children, mostly in other parts of the world. It's estimated that in 2010, 5 million people died as a result of the effects of climate change. A lot of those were direct effects of having to use charcoal and coal in the home, but a lot of those were due to the effects of the institutional use of fossil fuels and the effects of drought, poor harvests, and the like. And it's estimated that in the next decade or two, that figure is going to be magnified dramatically. Research suggests that empathy, which is a natural biological phenomenon in human mammals, is circumscribed by family, by race, by ethnicity, by distance, and by time. And so what we are dealing with climate change is the effects of our daily life on peoples at great distances and potentially in time frames that we're not used to even considering. But the thread that binds us in our religions, whether they are the Eastern religions of Confucianism or Hinduism or Buddhism or the Abrahamic religions, is the extension of empathy in intention to help, which is compassion. But Sandy was not the only event that happened in the last 12 months. You may have heard in the news that we had the worst tornado, the widest tornado ever in the United States this past spring in Oklahoma, in which 20 people were killed in devastated communities in Oklahoma. In Yosemite, the great national park, 400 square miles were burned. And although there were no human deaths, countless animals died. In another fire, we lost 19 firemen in Arizona. Floods in Colorado this fall killed 9 and destroyed many, many, many small communities in the Rocky Mountains. But the United States was not the only country that suffered severe weather. Malaysia had a flood that killed 7 and 23,000 people needed to be evacuated. Mozambique lost 70 people and 250,000 people had to be evacuated. In Jakarta in Indonesia, 40 people were killed by flash floods, leaving 100,000 homeless. Australia broke a heat record last January, and if you've been paying attention to the news, they're having another heat spell that's destroyed hundreds of homes around Sydney. New Zealand suffered the worst drought in 30 years. Spain had the wettest spring. In India, 5,700 died from flash floods. In the middle of the spring, Central Europe suffered the worst floods in 500 years, killing 19 people. And just recently in Mexico, 130 were killed by 2 storms that came right on the back of one another. And taking that empathy to the other than human again, just a few weeks ago, an early snowstorm in South Dakota killed 100,000 cattle. The worst of climate change affects those who are mostly not like us in this room, in places that we will probably never even set foot in or see other than in magazines and the news. And so, not only do our hearts reach out empathetically, but we hope and pray that our compassion will bring us to action on climate change. And the latest news from China. You may have heard that a city of 11 million in northeastern China had basically to close down because of smog. But the city of Shanghai, a city of 24 million people, realized because of its smog problem it had to do something. So it released a couple days ago its Clean Air Action Plan. And they are going to close down all coal-fired power in industrial operations and in boilers, and shift to clean energy by 2017. 5 years. It can be done. And we're here today to prod the EPA to recognize that there is no safe level of carbon dioxide in the air no more. And their carbon rule needs to stand as firm as possible so that we can move into a love thy neighbor world.